ora tātou katoa, e hui tahina, e tēnei rā. Thank you very much for joining us this morning for the webinar looking at some of the key projects undertaken under the Extreme Weather Research Platform. Great that you could make the time. Thank you to our researchers and presenters this morning and the team behind the scenes, and to all of you for making the time this morning. My name's Richard Smith. I'm the Director of the Resilience National Science Challenge, which has been providing support in the background for the extreme weather research projects under the platform. And I'm just going to settle us in with a karakia. The karakia is one developed for us by Josh Takani, and there's a link to that in the chat if you'd like to read along with the interpretation. And then I'm going to hand over to the team for further context for the morning and to get underway. We've got several presentations and not much time. He mihi e te pō, rangahawa ta ao, kia iorangi, kia io whenua, kina mata o te areki, kia mata nuku, kia mata rangi. E reira koe e tāne te waiora, ko ngā mōngaru, ko ngā awa para whenua, here utu ki tai kia tangaro e, ko koe, ko au, ko taua nei. Whiti ao, whiti ora, aramai te toki, haumi e, ue e, tai e. Thanks everyone. Over to Professor Wilson.
Kia ora tātou, ko Tom Wilson tōku ingoa. My name's Tom Wilson. I'm NEMA's Chief Science Advisor and had the privilege of being involved with the Extreme Weather Platform almost from the inception, both in terms of contributing needs in from the emergency management system for what the some of the science and research requirements were, and then also contributing as a champion of some of the projects. Just wanted to start out by acknowledging everybody that's on the call today. Thank you so much for joining this webinar. And also wanted to acknowledge everybody that's been affected by the severe weather events of last year. We see a number of people tragically lost their lives, and for so many more, their lives were also transformed by these very challenging events. And also wanted to acknowledge many of you who will be on the call today, still very much in the thick of it, both supporting communities that have been affected or potentially affected yourselves. So please know that we're all thinking of you and wishing you all the very, very best. Just, I guess, perhaps unsurprisingly from someone like me, I think it's important to note that science is such a critical part of disaster resilience. It provides an important component of our knowledge base, of understanding how the effects of these events have manifest on society, and what were the good and bad and ugly parts about them. But also, how, probably most importantly, how can we reduce these effects from occurring? What are the mitigation options or resilience strategies which better enable us to withstand or adapt or thrive through these types of events and the wider processes that lead us to that. So I'm extremely excited to see how the research projects have matured and what they're presenting back to us today. I do really stress that I think the evidence base that this platform provides, both for the ongoing recovery for many of our communities and regions that have been affected, is really important, and again, excited to see what the research projects have been achieving there. But in the medium to long term, this will be really critical data and knowledge and wider capability and capacity that's been developed here for hopefully contributing to New Zealand's ongoing or increasing disaster resilience. Massive thank you to the researchers and the research organisations that have put so much hard graft into this. And I also wanted to have a very warm thank you to Richard and the RNC team. You've been absolutely phenomenal with coordination of this platform. It's been a journey, but you've just been superb. So thank you, and extremely warm thanks to Nika and to Belinda for your incredible coordination and leadership through this as well. You've just been absolutely terrific. I guess the last thing I really just wanted to note as we kick into the presentations is a respectful request for the researchers here of please keep that critical motivation of wanting to share what you've learned and how can we ensure that this really precious work that's been created and this knowledge and wisdom that's been created, ensuring that that's shared for both now and well into the future. And for those of you on the webinar of seeing opportunities for this knowledge or material that's been produced of how can it be even more useful and effectual, and if there's gaps, that's really important too to learn through this. It's an important time. I'm very mindful as we've got a change of things in terms of our science system occurring at the moment. It's a slightly confronting time, but a really critical one as we face the years and decades ahead. So just a very, very warm thank you from me. Congratulations to all the researchers and everyone else that's been involved in this. And I can't wait to hear more about these projects. And again, just a final thought of just reflecting and remembering everybody that's been affected by these events. And thank you to those that are contributing this really important mahi for Aotearoa New Zealand's disaster resilience. Kia ora.
Thank you, Tom and Richard. Ko Belinda Story Aho. I am going to be the facilitator for today's session. I'm going to be keeping everyone on time. We've got 8 presentations today. Just to give you an overview of what this format is, they're going to be 5-minute lightning talks. After we've done the 8 presentations, we'll then move into a Q&A session. So as you're going through as you're listening to the talks, please put your cues into the chat session, and then I will curate those for the Q&A session at the end. If we run out of time, then we do have a mechanism to be able to connect you with the researchers so that they can answer the question directly for you. Because we've got so many fantastic presentations to go through today, in order to keep with the 5 minutes, we're going to be putting up a purple screen once the 5 minutes is reached. So when you see the purple screen, that's a signal to both the speaker and to the audience that we're going to be moving to the next speaker. So that with that in quick overview, let's move into our first speaker. So our first speaker is Jochen Smit. He's Chief Scientist for Environmental Information at NIWA, and he's going to talk about his work on the Emergency Event Database Catalogue.
Kia ora, everyone. Next slide, please. I guess the key aspect I want to talk today about is the challenge of data sharing during and preceding extreme events. During the events of last year, that was highlighted by various agencies as a key challenge. And I just want to present today I guess, an initial solution that we propose and we developed to support that. But before I do that, I introduce the National Environmental Data Center. Of course, that's the technology platform that the solution was built on. The National Environmental Data Center was initiated in 2019 by Science New Zealand, which is the mother organization for all the Crown Research Institutes in New Zealand. And we established in 2022 a governance group that I'm co-chairing to basically support ongoing maintenance and further developments of the platform. We launched the NETS webpage that you can see the link, nets.nz there. If you don't know it, please have a look at it. As a landing page catalog to CRI data sources. And we have since then improved this platform. We have included data quality frameworks, consistent data quality frameworks across CRIs, and we're working further towards integrating CRI data services as part of that collaboration. So why I'm telling you this? This is a platform we have developed, the CRIs, but when last year all these challenges around data sharing came up. Next slide, please. We came up with the idea of basically reusing our technology stack to build an extreme event data catalog. And catalog that enables quick sharing of data during extreme events to support response, recovery, etc. And particularly, I like to acknowledge Jill Jolly. She was instrumental in pushing that ahead. And here you see the various other people that were involved in the technology implementation. We were able to do in quite short order, which was 2 months, basically to stand up a separate service, which we call Emergency Event Catalogue. And you see the logo there, and you see also the URL there, eedc.net.nz, for which actually works, which can be used. We pre-populated it with some data from Gabriel and other events and did some testing. And unfortunately, this is where the story ends. We had some initial discussions last year around, okay, NETS as a CRI collaboration has stood this capability up. And we had further discussions around governance and ownership. We were very happy to support the platform, but we weren't sure if the CRIs were the right people or organizations to own the platform, i.e. the processes around it. So while we were okay with technology support, we were less, I guess, or lukewarm on the content support. Because I mean, as you guys know, in Ethereum, there's so many different agencies involved, and the science sector is only part of that. So what we have then done, because there was no big uptake, to start an MOU and as the CRIs. So we wanted to sign an MOU that the CRIs actually support that, and basically that means that each CRI agency takes on the particular events. When an earthquake happens, GNS will do that, and will basically own the content of the platform. Unfortunately, as you know, and as Tom indicated, we had some changes since last year, political changes, and we are under science review. So unfortunately, I can report signing of that MOU and further support of the platform is at the moment unclear to me. We had a chat, and of course, science and CE's trying to see and change as well. We had a chat with Kate just a few weeks ago, and we said, where should the direction go? We have a platform here that can be used. We just need to clarify who is actually owning it, who can use it. That's where we are. Next slide. If you are interested, this is how it looks like. You can basically create new events if you want. You can add data sets. It's a platform driven by a CMS and can be quite easily used. We're using the same platform for our more than 100 data sets we're sharing as CRIs with the public. And yeah, we're interested with anybody who is interested in that. I'm very happy to talk with anyone. Kira.
Thank you, Jochen. We're now going to hear from Kerry Lee, who is an engineering geologist at GNS, who's going to talk about rainfall-induced landslide forecasting. Over to you, Kerry.
Thanks very much. So I'm co-lead from GNS Science on the Cyclone Gabriel response. Next slide. We estimate 830,000 landslides were triggered by Cyclone Gabriel across the whole of the North Island. This is almost an unheard of number of landslides for a single event. So our end users, they wanted to know where these landslides occurred, how large they were, and once they initiated, where the debris went to. So thanks to the extreme weather research platform, we saw an opportunity to employ new technologies in order to both provide immediate answers to these questions to aid response and recovery, but also to generate a whole new kind of data to better train future landslide forecast models. This type of data that we generated can't be created by remote sensing. It requires trained users. And this is where we come to with the outcomes and stakeholders. So if we look at where we are today, together with the University of Canterbury, University of Auckland, Massey University, and Manaki Whenua, we've mapped 150,000 landslides to date. So we've covered about 10% of the worst affected region. And you can see in the second map from the left, a brief coverage of what we have mapped. This is the largest single event landslide catalogue to date. So we mapped using a priority grid. We focus first on life risk, We moved into lifelines, and then we looked at stakeholder interest where infrastructure was possibly impacted. And this allowed us to provide the data that was required at the time as we went through the mapping process. We trained 15 students. So these are New Zealand's future geohazard experts, and we used these students to help map the landslides, and they were key to undertaking this mapping in a timely fashion. We've had raw data available live to stakeholders since day one. So it's really important that this data was not going to be available at the end of the project, that it's there to be used and being used as we created the catalogue. And in the coming months, we'll have a checked and quality controlled version of the full catalogue that will be provided with our final report. As I said, this represents the largest single event landslide catalogue ever captured. So the data is already being used to improve rainfall-induced landslide forecasts, and we've partnered with Dragonfly Data Science to extrapolate our mapping results across the North Island. The mapping will feed into a new 5-year MBIE endeavour project, Sliding Lands, which will help us better forecast national landslide impacts. So if we look at the outputs, the data is available now, and the final version will be published in the coming months. We've got 2 reports coming, one outlining the new methodology that we've developed, and the other providing scientific information on the event itself. And we already are using this data in improved landslide forecast models that will only get better with time. So just on the right-hand side, there's a brief preview of mapping data that we've created being incorporated with laser ground models, where we're precisely defining every single landslide source volume. And we're also able to capture the debris deposition along the landslide trail. So this kind of analysis has never been possible without this data, and this is we were looking to move forward to with new information and new models. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Kerry. It's fantastic. We're now going to move on to Charlotte Brown, who's going to talk about, she is the Joint Managing Director of Resilience Organisations, and she's going to be talking about supporting critical infrastructure recovery. Over to you, Charlotte.
Thanks very much, Belinda. So I'm just presenting on behalf of myself and Liam Witherspoon at the University of Auckland. So our project had 2 main parts. The first part was the development of a spatio-temporal database of critical infrastructure performance. So we've learned from past events that it's so important to capture perishable data. If we don't do this, we're not going to really understand the vulnerability that our infrastructure networks have to these types of events, and therefore we're not going to understand how best to improve resilience of these networks and the services that they provide to communities. So we set about collecting all the data that we could around transportation, energy, communications, water, fast-moving consumer goods, banking and health. So a really wide range of critical infrastructure services. And we were looking at both physical damage, the loss of service due to that physical damage, and also the restoration through time. And we did that through gathering the physical data damage, but also surveying the likes of fast-moving consumer goods providers to understand how they adapted and dealt with the disruption. So we've done a fair bit of preliminary analysis on this data. We've looked at things like outages through time, so you can see the graph there for the electricity disruption. Analysis of damage modes on the right-hand side, you can see the road network and analysis of what led to the asset damage, whether it was flood, landslide or bridge damage. Sector and location disruption analysis, so both looking across one infrastructure, but also looking within a geographical area and really trying to understand the interdependencies between the infrastructure and how one disruption in one network cascades into another network. So we're really at the beginning of making the most of this database, and we're connecting with a number of other ongoing research projects, a couple of endeavour projects, some have already been mentioned before, to really make the most of this database and learn and build on that experience. The next slide. Thanks. The next part of this project was, or which was actually done first, was development of some policy briefs. We did this really soon after we got the funding, so within the first four to 5 months. Based on international lessons learnt, we created a couple of policy briefs to support those organisations that were undertaking recovery programs for critical infrastructure. The first was on recovery lessons, which covered things like governance, operational program management, recovery sequencing and coordination. So which infrastructure do we deal with first and which parts of the network to maximise the benefit to the community. Recovery resourcing, community engagement, managing information needs both within the program but also externally with communities, and decision making. The second policy brief was focused on how we could build back resilience within that recovery program. So not building back vulnerabilities into the networks, but making sure we're building back better. So within that, we had a bit of a description of the different types of approaches you can take to make these assessments. So both a risk-based and an impact-based approach. So the risk-based looks at specific hazards and the damage that are expected from those different hazards. And the impact-based is a more hazard-agnostic approach based on the criticality of different infrastructure. So the part of that brief was criticality assessment and prioritisation. So as you can see there's a link to the final policy briefs and supplementary reports that back that up. You'll see that the database that we've created of the damage is not currently published, but if you're interested in that data, that you can speak to myself or Liam. And just lastly, a thanks to all the organisations that were involved in this project. It really was a big team effort. So thanks very much.
Thanks, Charlotte. Now we're going to move on to Nick Horspool, who is a risk specialist at GNS, and he's going to talk about Riskscape. Over to you, Nick.
Kia ora koutou, ko Nick Horspool toko ingoa. I'm from GNS Science, as Belinda mentioned. So in our project, immediately after Cyclone Gabrielle, after discussions with NEMA and other key response and recovery agencies, we identified the need for collating risk information and helping make that available for key stakeholders and end users to make risk-based decision-making in the response and recovery from the event. We've seen this in other events where this information is often disparate and not available, and so we want to try to address that following Cyclone Gabrielle. Now, we did that by leveraging an existing project called Riskscape, which is a model that we've developed in New Zealand for risk assessment for natural hazards and climate change, and it's been funded over the past decade by MBIE. So we were really able to leverage all that existing science and work that we've done in the past decade and apply that to this project. So we had two key components in this project. The first was collating risk model information. So the risk model was combined of both hazard data. So what is the hazard event that occurs? Oh, can you please go back to the original slide? And we were able to bring in information from the landslide project that Kerry talked about, as well as MBIE Endeavour, flood modelling projects, and bring that into the Riskscape platform. We then used information from some of the event response databases that Jochen talked about. So we brought in information that included the post-disaster surveys and tagging information of damaged buildings. And we were able to develop an exposure database of buildings and infrastructure at the individual asset level, so the individual building level. We then combine that with information on how those hazards impacts those buildings and infrastructure to allow the model to produce estimates of life safety risk, as well as the reinstatement costs to buildings and infrastructure and downtime of buildings and infrastructure, like Charlotte talked about. Now, this model was multi-hazard, so it included landslides, floods, coastal inundation, earthquakes, and tsunamis. We really wanted to make sure that the risk information that was being portrayed was not just what happened in the event, but actually what we would need to think about in terms of future risks as we move forward over the next, say, 100 years. So it was multi-hazard, multi-impact lens. We also included a temporal component, so there was elements of climate change and population growth into the model as well. So we could look at the risk not just now, but actually into the future. We then built these risk models and put them onto the Riskape platform, which is an online cloud-based system where users can run models and visualize the outputs, which you can see on the right side of the slide. So we could assess the impacts at a property level as well as aggregated to suburbs and regions. The model then could be used to evaluate the what if. So not just accepting what we have with the current risk, but what would happen if we, in the recovery, actually made some decisions to mitigate risk. So for example, what if buildings that were repaired or rebuilt had a higher floor level for future floods, or potentially retreat from certain areas of high risk? The model could then be rerun and the community impacts could be re-evaluated to quantify the benefit of those mitigation measures. I'd just like to also say thanks to EQC Tōku Tuako, who helped co-fund this project, as well as the funding from MBIE. Next slide, please. So the key outcomes of this project was an online system where users such as central government agencies, local government, and other users could access this risk information and make some of those risk-informed decision-making elements. Next slide, please. So the key outputs is really this online tool, Riskape. So this can be made available at riskape.nz. There is currently a login required for that. So if anyone is interested in access, please contact either Ryan from NIWA, who's one of the project leaders, or myself, and we can provide login access. There's also a report which summarizes all of the risk models and how that information was brought together, as well as how the tool can be used. That'll be available very shortly on the Extreme Weather SIF project website. Kia ora.
Thanks, Nick. Now we're going to move on to Warwick Allen. He's a researcher at Manaaki Whenua, and he's going to talk about integrated ecological impact assessment.
Thanks, Belinda. Yes, so I'm going to talk about our project, which was a collaboration between Manaaki Whenua and NIWA. We had three main project objectives. First one was to identify changes in the extent and condition of vegetation cover as a result of Cyclone Gabrielle. Second was to evaluate impacts on wetlands, naturally uncommon and threatened ecosystems and species. And then finally, NIWA led the part of the project on quantifying resilience of resident fish and macroinvertebrate communities and recolonisation of migratory fish species. Next slide. So this map on the left is sort of an overview of where we collected data from throughout the project. I won't go through every point in detail, obviously, but before I highlight a few examples, I just wanted to say a big thanks to all of our project partners, regional councils and other organisations that without them this work would not have been possible, of course. They played a huge role in this project. So a few little bits of data that we collected. The first part was we did a sort of an aerial image assessment intersecting a damage layer that was produced by another group here at Manaaki Whenua of new bare ground. So this was eroded areas or sediment deposition, and intersecting that across different ecosystem types. Next, we visited forests and quantified wind damage in the Bay of Plenty. Next. NIWA collected eDNA and macroinvertebrate community samples. This is the blue dots in the Hawke's Bay and Gisborne region. We revisited wetlands that had been sampled before the cyclone. Those are the blue squares in the Hawke's Bay region. And I interviewed over 60 eco-sanctuaries around the North Island to get an idea of the impacts on conservation infrastructure and threatened species. So a few of the key findings on the next slide. Actually quite good news for our native ecosystems. So compared to pastoral ecosystems and exotic plantations, native vegetation experienced a lot less damage. So this figure on the right shows the new bare ground. That's the other land care research map. And the key takeaway here is that for all these different ecosystem types, we see the percent of damage is less than 2% overall. And for ecosystems like indigenous forests, so that's your tall, mature podocarp forest, less than 1% of damage. So fairly good news, better than we expected anyway. Wetlands, we saw much the same. So this is showing wetland condition index. If we go back one. So this is a composite score of about 20 different variables, and wetland condition only declined by about 5% compared to pre-cyclone levels, and this was largely as a result of sediment input and damage to vegetation. Next. Freshwater fish species fared remarkably well, actually. So on the left of all of these slides, you can see pre-cyclone levels. So this is showing eDNA data from NIWA and Hawke's Bay Regional Council. And then autumn 2023, so immediately after the cyclone, we saw declines in some species, increases in other species. And then a year on from the cyclone, most of those species appeared to have reached pre-cyclone levels again, or if not better in some situations. So pretty good news for freshwater fish as well. Next. But what we did find was that it was uncommon ecosystems, threatened species, and conservation infrastructure that appeared to be most at risk. So this is ecosystems that have ecosystems or species that have a narrow distribution or that have low population sizes. They're obviously going to be much more at risk to these extreme weather events. And so one example here is from braided rivers in the Hawke's Bay, where banded dotterel numbers declined by up to about 50%. In some catchments and didn't decline in others. So there was quite a bit of variation in where these effects were occurred. And we saw consistent patterns between banded dotterels, black-fronted dotterels, pied stilt, South Island pied oystercatcher. So multiple species affected there. And then when we think about eco-sanctuaries, you saw a landslip taking out one of those predator-proof fences. Well, over 30% of eco-sanctuaries with predator-proof fences had breaches of those fences. So they hold our most precious taonga. So potentially big impacts there. Thankfully, no damage done. One final thing was that good baseline data is critically important. We need that pre-cyclone data to assess the impacts of the cyclone. Next. Long-term impacts remain uncertain, so we're yet to figure out whether or not these ecosystems are recovering. So that's a future question that remains unanswered. And finally, keep an eye out for all of this information and more that's going to come out in our report at the end of September. That'll be our main output. Thanks.
Thanks, Warwick. That's great. We're now going to move on to Lee Tate, who is a marine ecologist at NIWA and going to talk about the impacts of extreme weather on our coastal marine ecosystems. Over to you, Lee.
Kia ora tātou. So yeah, I'm Lee Tate. I'm based at NIWA in Christchurch, and I've been leading the Marine Coastal Impacts Program, trying to understand how Cyclone Gabriel in particular affected our nearshore marine ecosystems. The area of focus has been really heavily within the Te Tairāwhiti region and East Cape, and this is an area that has historically had some of the highest rates of sedimentation in the marine coastal zone, with really significant implications for the types of plants and animals that live in these habitats. So these nearshore ecosystems provide a range of essential services to humanity, particularly the kelps and seaweeds that persist on these reefs. They fix, they store, and they sequester carbon. They support fisheries, soak up excess nutrients, they dampen the influence of waves, and they produce oxygen. They also provide habitat for a huge range of biodiversity in these ecosystems, and the loss of kelps and seaweed ecosystems really shifts the balance of what these ecosystems are and the services they provide. Unfortunately, they're very vulnerable to sedimentation, and the sediment can affect these ecosystems in a number of ways, from blocking the light available to photosynthesis, but also impacting the recruitment or the regeneration of populations by smothering the habitat at the rock type that they need to bind to and to fix and find a home. So the animation that's probably a little bit running a little bit slowly shows some satellite imagery that we've analysed to look at the amount of light reaching the seafloor in the region, and if it's working well enough, which it might not be, you'll see a big bunch of red values that are related to very strong sedimentation around the time of Cyclone Gabriel. So big changes to these ecosystems. Next slide, please. So we used those final two pictures in that slide were showing the two tools that we've used across this program, remote underwater vehicles and aerial drones. So this is some pre-cyclone imagery across an existing gradient of sedimentation into Mata Amawe in Hawke's Bay. And so at our high sedimented areas, we don't have a lot of these big brown seaweeds, our habitat forming seaweeds. And as we go to less areas of less and less sediments, we see an increasing number of these large brown habitat forming kelps. And if we click to the next slide, we should see a swipe through of what it looked like after the cyclone. So after Cyclone Gabriel, we saw big changes in the seafloor community. At our highly sedimented site, we didn't see a huge shift in what the communities look like, but at our central site, we saw almost complete loss of some of these habitat forming brown seaweeds. And then at the other end of the spectrum, at our low sedimentation site, we actually saw very few impacts. So there are some big changes that have occurred because of the sedimentation, because of the flooding and freshwater. Some of our sites revealed a high proportion of woody debris knocking around on the reef, and we also saw visible signs of mortality of some of these kelps, as shown by remnants of these species. So these gradients of sedimentation really do show significant impacts of the cyclone, but also of concern a potential legacy that these sediments are now in the environment and will continue to potentially cause problems. Next slide, please. So over the course of this study, we mapped over 15 locations with aerial imagery, and we've been doing that alongside Ngā Hapu o Ngāti Porou, a group of hapu up and down the Te Tairawhiti region, who have legislative rights of kaitiaki to their coastal areas. So we've mapped a huge range of locations for the hapu at Ngāti Porou, and we will now analyse over 2 terabytes of multispectral imagery to see what these communities look like across gradients of sedimentation, but also hopefully set a baseline for understanding future changes and legacies of these events. And this project was the last to be started up, and so we're a little bit behind on delivering, in that we have a deadline of December written into our proposal. So we hope to make all of that available to all of our stakeholders by December, and we will also produce a Esri story map to visualise this for a range of stakeholders. So kia ora, thanks for listening.
Thanks, Lee. Now we're going to move on to Murray Ford, who's Associate Professor of Environment at the University of Auckland, and he's going to talk about mapping cyclone-driven erosion. Over to you, Murray.
Good, thanks for that. Yeah, Murray Ford, School of Environment at the University of Auckland. I'm going to be talking about some work done by a larger project team driven by Mark Dixon, Emma Ryan, Megan Tuck and myself as part of the Resilience Challenge within the National Science Challenge. So we've been mapping coastal change around New Zealand over multi-decadal timescales. So most of our record of change is over the last 80 years or so. And obviously nested within that quite sparsely sampled record have been a number of prior storms. And we've been unable to attribute changes on the coast to those particular storms because we don't have a record of before and after change. And so Cyclone Gabrielle has obviously occurred at a time where we now have incredible access to high resolution satellite imagery and aerial photos and the like. So it provided an opportunity to assess how much erosion can occur during a single event. And so the aim of this project was basically to embed the changes observed as a result of Cyclone Gabrielle within that long-term 80-year record. And this is important because it provides a context. Yeah, we can see which parts of the coast have eroded back into already eroding coastline, what erosion is occurring on stable stretches, and likewise, what areas of accreting coast have perhaps had some erosion cut back into that recent accretion. And this is really important when we think about how we derive hazard zones along the coast, which typically involve some integration of a long-term and a short-term rate of change. And so we're hopeful that this will be really useful for providing that short-term storm cut within the calculation of those hazard zones. So on the next slide, we'll just see some really quick examples of what we've typically seen through this project. And we acquired commercial high-resolution imagery from before the cyclone, or as recent before the cyclone as possible, as well as close to the cyclone following as possible as well. So we tasked or acquired commercial imagery from North Cape down to the Hawke's Bay. Used other sources as well, LINs and councils were also collecting imagery, so we kind of integrated that, and we see a fairly consistent pattern of between, say, 5 and 15 metres of erosion in pockets along the North Island east coast. In this example here, we see Whangamata on the left, Mahanga Beach in the northern Hawke's Bay in the centre, and then Matarangi on the Coromandel Peninsula. I guess the most interesting thing we've observed in this example is if you focus on that centre one, the Mahanga Beach has actually continued to erode quite rapidly following the cyclone. So in places, Gabrielle's kind of triggered a state change from a gradually eroding coast to a much more rapidly eroding. So if we think about that in the next slide in terms of kind of the time series of change, we can see now these are time series of how the coast has moved, whether it's accretion like we see there at Marsden Point, or stability with those blue lines, or the erosion with the yellow lines. And we can see all along that coast this little blip at the end there with maybe 3 or 4 data points, and that's the impact of Gabrielle at those different sites. So at Marsden Point, we may have had 100 metres of accretion over the last 80 years, and then Gabrielle has cut back maybe 5 to 15 metres. Likewise, other areas that have been stable have had that cut in there, and other places that are already eroding have continued. And so we're going to continue to monitor selected sites over the next kind of 12 to 24 months to see whether that erosion is continuing or whether it was a one-off episode in the kind of background behaviour of the coast at those locations. This data set and record will be combined with the resilience coastal change record and published within the next kind of few months on a data platform hosted by Coordinates. So that's the work we've been doing on coastal erosion as a result of Gabrielle. Thanks.
Thanks, Murray. Now we're going to move on to Sarah Jane Payne. She's an Associate Professor of Medical and Health Sciences at the University of Auckland, and she's going to talk about how understanding extreme weather events are impacting rangatahi and whānau wellbeing. Over to you, Sarah Jane.
Tēnā tātou, ko Sarah Jane tōku ingoa no tūhoi ahau. Thank you for your time today. I'm really proud to be here on behalf of the Growing Up in New Zealand longitudinal study. So for our contribution to this important kaupapa, what we really wanted to be able to support is an understanding of how the extreme weather events have impacted young people and their whānau. So our cohort at Growing Up in New Zealand in 2023 were aged 14 to 15 years old, and we knew we had families living in the areas that were primarily affected by the extreme weather events. So we really wanted to leverage the relationships we have with young people and families, the data that we've been collecting over the first 15 years of their lives, and the systems that we have available to be able to stand up a survey and to collect this important wellbeing information rapidly for the purposes of sharing it as soon as possible. So for our extreme weather survey, we designed 2 questionnaires, one for our young people to complete and one for their mother or primary caregiver to complete. We collected data between August and early September last year. And I want to thank the Chief Science Advisors who met with us to help us understand what some of the pressing issues were when it came to wellbeing impacts in the regions of Te Tai Tokerau, Tamaki Makaurau, Te Tai Rāwhiti Gisborne and Te Matau Maui Hawke's Bay. Thank you. So in this slide, we've just provided a snapshot of some of the key findings that we thought might be interesting for everyone this morning. So in our study, over 50% of participants reported that they didn't receive enough information or advice about how to prepare for these extreme weather events. We saw across our cohort that there were significant disruptions to essential services lasting several days. But what we've thought was really important was that the impact of those infrastructure disruptions differed depending on the regions in which the young people and their families were living. So essentially, whānau living here in Tamaki Makaurau, the duration of impact was often shorter than for those families living out in Northland, Gisborne, Te Tai Rāwhiti and Hawke's Bay. We asked a range of questions of these families around their need for support and services, and then we also asked them of those service needs, what did they actually receive? And so importantly, we saw quite high levels of what we call unmet need for support services, and these support services covered financial needs and supports, their need for healthcare and medical care, their access to food and a range of other essential services in the days and weeks following these extreme weather events. One of the areas in growing up in New Zealand where we've collected very robust longitudinal data is in the area of mental wellbeing. And so we wanted to understand how these extreme weather events impacted how young people felt from a mental wellbeing perspective in the months following those two weather events. And what we could see was a pattern where young people who said that they were affected by the extreme weather events, whatever that meant to them, they tended to also report poorer mental health outcomes in terms of the level of depression symptoms, anxiety symptoms, and also some poorer sleep quality. We also wanted to share that across our survey findings, we can see, and this was one of our primary goals, we can see that rangatahi, that young people require targeted support, and there are specific areas in which they want to receive some better sort of youth-friendly information. But what I thought was also interesting for us to highlight is that young people aren't just recipients of support and care following these extreme weather events. We have information to suggest they also want to support other people in their communities. They want to care for and support young people who across New Zealand who might be going through similar situations of disruption and despair, but they also wanted to be actively involved in the sort of recovery and future response planning in these particular communities. And so the quotes that we've provided in this slide just give you a little bit of insight into how young people think about where communities of support could exist, and this could be particularly important for schools to know about, but this idea that they also want to be out there supporting others to recover and to feel well following these extreme weather events. Next slide, please. In terms of the outputs and data that we've created, all of our information is available to the public. So a primary objective was to provide qualitative and quantitative insights into the human experience of Cyclone Gabrielle and the Auckland anniversary weekend flood events. So all of our report and information is already available on our website, and we've also produced some regional snapshots of key findings for the areas that were most impacted by Cyclone Gabrielle, and they're available from our team. The data set that we created off the back of those two young people and primary caregiver surveys is already available for researchers to access to answer other really important questions that might be coming through based on your own experience undertaking research projects through this platform, but also future questions that are going to crop up. And so, for example, the longitudinal impacts of these two extreme weather events is something that growing up in New Zealand could uniquely contribute to Aotearoa when we're thinking about stronger, more resilient future response planning. The data sets are available free for use via our existing data access process at Growing Up in New Zealand. And we also believe it's really important to give back to young people who are so generous in their contributions to Growing Up in New Zealand and who completed these questionnaires in very large numbers. So we created with support from a clinical psychologist who was part of the study, what we call the Uncivil Defence Guide, which is really a resource for young people to give them some support strategies, some tips and tricks on how they may be able to manage their emotional response following an extreme weather event. That Uncivil Defence Guide is available on our website for anyone to download, to share with your communities, to share with young people that you know of who might find that very useful. And we were also very proud to partner with Toi Matarua, which is a rangatahi Māori-led research organisation who live and work within Hawke's Bay. And with the support of the funding from MB, we were able to partner with them to create a short film about Moko Boys, which is a rangatahi-initiated support system where young people are supporting typically kaumātua, older people in the Hawke's Bay area, and creating those really important social connections and supports following Cyclone Gabrielle. And that short film was released at the end of 2023. So thank you again to MB for the funding, and particularly to the whānau of Growing Up in New Zealand who make all of this possible through their ongoing support of our study. Older.
Thank you, Sarah Jane. Thank you to all the presenters. We're now going to move into a Q&A session. So we've got a fantastic number of questions in the chat, so I'm going to do my darndest to work through those. Okay, question for Jochen. The regional councils are also generating a lot of data. Is there a mechanism for sharing or integrating the data that is generated by regional councils?
So that's the purpose of the EEDC. So basically having a catalog dedicated for a particular event that points to different data sources. And we heard today, for example, that there are many other data sources created. But of course, the problem is they always lie with particular agencies. So the purpose of the EEDC basically was providing a catalog that can point to important data that's relevant for a particular event. And so yes, data can be cataloged and thereby easier discovered.
Right. Okay, thank you. So there was a question for Kerry, but has been answered, which is where can the landslide data be accessed? So if you see in the chat, it'll provide information on where it can be accessed. There's a number of questions coming through about how data is shared. So there's another question asking whether there's a platform to share Kerry's data, the landslide data, with other infrastructure owners. Kerry, from your perspective, how is your data shared with people outside your research team?
So up till now, we've had a screening process where we look at the requirements of the stakeholders, and if they have an immediate use requirement for the data, then they can just get in touch with us or Janine Bidme at GNS. Her email is in the chat, and we can provide access through ArcGIS or QGIS platforms. In terms of the final QA dataset, this will be released with a final report in the coming months. And at this stage, I probably recommend anyone just wait for the final dataset.
Okay. And another question that's been answered, which is about, again, mapping from other agencies and how that's made available. So there's an answer on that. It's a very strong theme that we're coming through on all of these questions is data, once data has been generated, Is it available? How is it available? When it is available. So I think data availability and access is a key theme that we're seeing with a number of these questions. Another one that we've got is what percentage of the affected areas have been mapped, and that was discussed, it was 10%. And then there's another question following on saying, well, if only 10% have been mapped, how can you attribute events, landslides to Cyclone Gabriel as opposed to subsequent weather? Again, that's been answered in the chat. Another question is, has the data been included in national catastrophic planning effort? Yeah, I think that there's probably, again, this theme around data is where data is held in a number of different agencies. How is that brought together at a central government perspective to allow us to plan for these events at a national scale? So perhaps that's pointing to that key issue. Another question we have is regards to landslide forecasting. Does this relate only to rain-related slips, or could it also be applied to earthquakes? Again, that's been answered in the chat, so thanks for being so proactive and responding to those questions. The next question is, was Northland included in the project? That's a question for you, Kerry.
Yeah, this is a really good question, and unfortunately, I don't have a good answer for this. So we pushed from the start of the event to get aerial imagery for the Northland region because we realized that it had been hard hit by Cyclone Gabriel. We flew helicopter surveys immediately after the event to generate reconnaissance images of the region. However, we didn't get any imagery that allowed us to map landslides in Northland, and that's, I guess, a big lesson for next time, because unfortunately we don't have the data that we can use to train models in that region now. So hopefully in coming years and coming events, we can have a bigger push to get imagery up there.
Okay, thanks, Kerry. Then we've got a question for Charlotte, which you've answered, so great for that, which is when you measured infrastructure, did you take note of the state of what was before and after? Again, Charlotte's answered that in the chat, so thanks for that. A question for Nick. How does the Enhanced Natural Hazard Assessment tool work with proposed national policy statement on natural hazard decision making?
Yeah, good question. So we designed the tool for, I guess, recovery decision making, but it can the framework can equally be used for sort of business as usual land use planning decision making by local government. And we did a project that was supported by EQC Tokatuake last year that showed how the same risk-scape models can be used for land use planning decision making on intensification and future climate change risk. And I'll put a link in the chat to where you can access that report. But essentially, you can use these models to quantify what the impacts are for local communities. And then by using community-based tolerances, you can then categorize the risks as high, medium, low, much like in the MPS. And then the tool, again, can be used for identifying how to manage those risks and bring it down to an acceptable level. So the framework can be applied both in the sort of recovery lens as well as normal land use planning.
Thanks. Now I've got a question for Warwick. Again, you've answered in this chat. So Warwick talked about, mention was made of eDNA for baseline data to determine resilience of freshwater fish species. So thanks for answering that in the chat. That's great. Questions for Murray. Do you, again, this one was answered in the chat. So do you have any sections which have recovered? So thanks for answering the chat. And then there's another question. Do we have an idea where all the eroded sediment has gone? Question for you, Murray.
That's a good question. Well, typically when a beach erodes, it moves offshore, sitting on a sandbar, which then gradually works its way back onto the beach face. And I suspect that's what we've seen along a lot of the East Coast. Yeah, we were at Mangawhai a few weeks ago, and the there's a really extensive offshore sandbar there, which looks like it's working its way back onshore. So I suspect that's where a lot of that sand is sitting. It's not entirely lost to the system, but it's certainly sitting offshore of where it was before the cyclone.
Okay, thanks. And then the next question for you, Sarah Jane, is how can people contact you to get a copy of the report? If you have a look, there was, I think, information in your slides. So
yes, and someone has helpfully, sorry, I can't use the chat to answer questions, but the link to our report has been put into the chat.
Excellent. Thank you, Sarah Jane. Really appreciate the openness that you've got with your data and your reports. It's fantastic. So a couple of general questions. Gisborne District Council is also mapping landslides covering gaps in their area, which potentially validates the GNS mapping. In some cases, they can differentiate between Cyclone Hale and Cyclone Gabriel. So as they have already mapped prior events, for example, June 2018 and March 22, they're able to establish the landslides that occurred through specific events. Another question we had is, all of the data is incredibly helpful for emergency recovery. There's a request here that could the information that was generated in these projects be not only shared with regional science, flood and hazard staff, but also with group recovery managers who hold this statutory responsibility for coordinating the recovery in our regions. So I know because NINCA in particular has been very involved in hosting monthly meetings with science managers to discuss these projects over the last year. So there definitely has been strong communication through the science managers and the affected councils. But a note to your request that there's also communication to the group recovery managers. If someone would like to perhaps send through an email to NINCA, we can perhaps incorporate some feedback about how that might work. Ideally, direct communication with your science managers, but if there is some other forum, then we're happy to take that feedback. There's also, sorry, Tom, go ahead.
Thanks, Belinda. I just thought I should make a comment on that one, given it's been a messy space. Mark, I think you're spot on with your question, and I guess my response would be, it's given the relatively unique recovery structures that were set up, it made it quite challenging to connect in most effectively. So very keen to learn from you and your recovery manager peers what would have been a better approach as we take lessons for next time. It was very much a all efforts we were trying to push out as hard as we could, but obviously not to the right areas. So yeah, keen to catch up with you offline if that would be helpful.
Thanks, Tom. Next one, we've got a comment, talks about data being created, and it talks, I know that we've got a couple of comments on this. So this comment talks about build back better as an aspiration, and that the challenge can be funding and insurance policy constraints. So Charlotte has commented to that. And then there's also a feedback on the term build back better, which is group recovery managers no longer use the term build back better. So getting an understanding of how we make better decisions in the recovery is important, but can be constrained in some cases by funding and insurance policy constraints. Another comment we have is that it would be brilliant to have a Cyclone Gabriel nationwide impact synthesis report. I can signal that a synthesis report is being generated based on the research that has been undertaken as part of the extreme weather research platform. So that will be something that is available in the coming months. It will focus on the synthesis of this set of research. So it won't cover all of the impacts from Cyclone Gabrielle, but it will provide a synthesis of the research that has been undertaken in this platform. Another comment is it would be good to have a post-event data collection methodology, including ethical constraints, templates, metadata requirements, data storage, privacy that can be scaled and used for smaller events. I could not agree more. That would be really helpful to have a database for emergency management as well as for adaptation. Another question. Talks about the recent fire seasons have been particularly challenging in New Zealand, Port Hills, Lake Aho. Do we include wildfires as part of this project? So this program of work was very much in response to the major events that occurred last year. So the Auckland anniversary events and Cyclone Gabrielle. So it wasn't looking at issues around wildfire, but of course, wildfire is something that is a challenge that we will face into the future. So thinking about what research needs to be undertaken in that space is something that I'm sure researchers will be looking at. Another question is, were there any comparisons to results from similar research in the past, such as post-Canterbury earthquakes? Charlotte, can I throw that one to you?
Yeah, not explicitly at the moment, but the potential is there. I guess different hazards, but there's, particularly when you talk about infrastructure, there's a lot of similarities in terms of the processes that are gone through and how we understand that, and then how we take that data and then help that to inform our future ability to model the impacts of future hazard events. So yeah, the potential's there. Explicitly with this funding, we haven't done that for the infrastructure.
But there are a number of researchers who have been involved in both events. And so I'm sure if there was a need, then that's something that you would be able to contribute to. Has any research been completed on horticulture and arable lands impacted by Cyclone Gabrielle? And what are your insights? So I'm not sure if there was a specific project on that. Is there anyone who would like to comment on that one?
Belinda, maybe I could just offer a few thoughts on that. So there was nothing super explicit for the extreme weather platform here, but MPI and a few other agencies, but particularly MPI, funded a substantive amount of work in that space. So I think they've got some of that starting to come onto the MPI website, or equally feel free to reach out to me and I can connect you with relevant contacts if that would be helpful. Got it.
Which is very much a follow on to the next question as well, which was, is there focused research on the impact on the primary sector? This information would be very useful for developing policies to improve resilience in the sector. So that Tom's answer to the previous question also signals to this one as well. Next question, as part of the XRB climate disclosures, we are needing to quantify anticipated financial impacts of extreme weather events. Do you have any leads in the financial impacts?
Sort of would be the answer. Certainly Treasury and Reserve Bank were interested around some of that, but maybe easier to take it up offline if because I haven't got a pithy answer ready to go now.
Sure. Okay. Next one is this is a question that has been answered in the chat. So is there an estimate of the volume of sediment added to the coastal systems through Gabrielle? And so that has been answered in the chat. The next, we're almost through our questions. The next quick comment talks about these projects have been attempted within a science system framework where data sharing and principles of open or public good science are not well supported at an institutional level. Perhaps these structural limitations can be addressed in the current science system review. Certainly this activity fits well within the stewardship concept which Gluckman is talking about. The next question we have is, there has been public concern about impacts on air quality from remobilised silt. Has the research platform generated any public-facing data? So we did have there is a project that was funded under this program looking at air quality. Unfortunately, the lead for that research wasn't able to join this webinar, but we can certainly share that question with that researcher. The next question, which is our last question, was the cyclone recovery unit involved in the scoping up of any of these projects? Tom, I'm going to leave that one to you as well.
No, these projects, so phase 0 and phase 1, which is most of what these projects are, were all underway prior to the cyclone recovery units formally standing up. So we had been moving at pace. I believe that there was some connection with elements of the CRU for some of the projects, but individual researchers will be better placed to comment about that. But I'd probably be fairly comfortable putting on the record that given the very unique nature of the national recovery arrangements, it was quite an effort to even connect in and get things moving in those first couple of months. And that, that's probably a story for another day in some ways, but it was, I think, important to remember that most of the decisions around these projects were done back in March and into April, early April of last year. So those of us that were on the assessment panel were relying a lot from intelligence on the ground and information coming in, but also using a lot of, I guess, experience from previous events of what might be useful in the short to medium term going forward. So I think in some cases we got it right. In some cases there'll be lessons for next time. So, but again, I think there's some good scholarly work that could be done unpicking some of that as well. Kia ora.
Thanks, Tom. And then we've got one last comment. We have a little bit of time, so if you do have one or two last questions, we do have a little bit of time to fit those in. So one last comment is the question about finance and costs speaks to the importance of learning from Sisyphus of the impacts from the entirety of the event, not just the amazing work done so rapidly with this excellent platform. We can then compare events from the past and get a better understanding of the systemic risks of tomorrow. So that is the end of our questions and comments, unless there is last couple of questions in the chat. So there's someone from DPMC who's made a comment here that says, thanks for the great presentation and all of your work, this person works at the Cyclone Recovery Unit, and that they are doing some thinking about improving future policy settings and maybe reaching out as needed to tap into the wealth of knowledge. So excellent example of connecting with policymakers of this webinar. I'm going to allow two more questions. So I've got one more. Excellent, we've got some more coming in. So one of the key issues relates to the outputs of the research in an accessible format. So not just having the data and having it technically available, but having it in a format that is able to be accessed. And the question is, are there plans for this to be spread wider? So I know that data is a key factor that is being considered by the Finance and Expenditure Committee when it is looking at adaptation from a climate change perspective. So yes, data is something that is being considered at a central government level. Another question we have is, but says potentially a question for another time, is there a need for private sector to help support and develop the strategy for connected databases and technology platforms to improve both response and recovery? If so, how do they get involved? One immediate mechanism is perhaps by communicating through existing formats, such as that the Select Committee. I think the Select Committee submissions have closed, but whatever policy response comes out, that would be one mechanism. And then there's just a final comment, which I'm going to end with. Oh, no, I've got one more. Climate data, MFE's Climate Data Initiative is focusing on adaptation data governance. Are there data governance people connected, are the recovery data governance people connected with the MFE Climate Data Initiative? That is something that, unless Tom's keen on commenting on that now, I think I can perhaps comment that one of the roles that I have is I am on the independent reference group appointed by the Minister of Climate Change to advise on the adaptation platform. So I have one mechanism for connecting into that MFE Climate Data Initiative. But Tom, do you have any comments on that one?
Kia ora, great question. In short, yes, but it's been a bit of a process, but I think there is some really positive connections being made. So yeah, certainly be keen to hear more around aspirations or whatever might be useful there. But I think there is some a good head of steam getting built up in that space. Okay,
I'm now going to close off and with the last comment that says, awesome mahi, great to see the results heading out to us for utilising in future planning. So thank you, Lamorna, for that comment. I'm now going to hand over to our host, Richard, to close the session with a karakia.
Ngā mihi, Belinda, thanks for that. Yeah, and just before closing this out, formally, just acknowledgements to all of the presenters and the wider group of researchers who have been involved in the platform. It's been really encouraging to see the level of willingness and engagement to participate in what has really been a little bit of an experiment, I guess, and how we mobilise science in times of emergency responses. Just a couple of housekeeping things that speak to some of the queries around data and accessibility, I guess, of the work. Noting that not all of the projects were presented today, so there is a view into the wider set of projects under the platform through the website, and there were links to that in the chat. And to note that the platform is coming to an end, so essentially this Thursday is the final day of formal existence of the platform, and similarly for the Resilience National Science Challenge. However, the website access will continue for a number of years, so probably at least 5 years. So the project information that continues to come through with reporting will be uploaded over the next wee while and will continue to be accessible, as will the webinar videos, so including this one, and links to various kind of data portals. So yeah, thank you all to the attendees. It was great to see the numbers kind of almost tap out at, I think our maximum is 500, and we pretty much got close to that. So really encouraging to see the level of engagement, clearly a lot of interest in this topic area. And I'll close this out now because I'm sure you're gagging for another cup of tea and a scone. A whakairihi e te tapu, me ngā kōrero ki runga, i wātia Aotearoa, ku turiki whakataha ai, kia turiki whakataha ai. Haumi e, hui e, tai e. Thanks everyone. Ka kite.